What's going on guys, Vanity here. Right, so I'm back with another tutorial. This time I'm going to be covering the topic of equalization. This tutorial is going to be on the controls of the equalizer, and towards the end of the video I'm going to get into some basic / advanced equalization techniques that are a few things that I wish I knew when I first started to apply equalization to my mix, because it would have helped me a great deal. Alright, so as far as music production is concerned, equalization is really just a fancy word for tone control. It's a device that can cut or boost particular parts of the audio spectrum. EQ can also be used to create new tonalities and to help correct or equalize problems that have occurred in the recording chain, although you should always strive to fix such problems first, but obviously this isn't always possible. It's also not always picked up on. So while your home hi-fi system might have basic bass and treble controls as TVs do, the studio equalizer, whether it's a hardware or a plugin, can be rather more sophisticated. So I want to get straight into the controls of an EQ. There are several controls on an equalizer that you're going to potentially be using all the time, but I want to cover the basic three and the main three that you're going to be using first, and I want to get into more detail speaking about these. So the first one is the gain, which is here. The middle knob. Once you've pushed a band in, the first control you should tweak is the gain control. Now the EQ will have no effect without some gain reduction or addition, no matter what you do with the other controls. Gain determines how much of a certain frequency is added or removed. Gain is the vertical axis on the EQ graph, and the taller it is, the more of the frequency is being added, or the opposite way around for removing frequencies. Gain is basically just controlling the volume at that frequency. So you can see here I'm boosting at 288 Hz, adding 5 decibels of gain. I'm basically just boosting that frequency and some surrounding frequencies. Very simple concept, maybe the most simple out of the three. Right, so the next control is the Q, which is this one here. So the Q determines how wide or narrow the EQ band is. A setting of 0 will pretty much encompass the whole entire spectrum, obviously depending on your gain, while a setting of 10 will only affect a very small range of frequencies. So here you can see my Q is fairly average, around 1 is the norm. Now you can see I'm boosting quite a wide range of frequencies. So if you look at this band here, it's very sharp. It's got a very high Q setting, which means that it's boosting a very certain set of frequencies. So you can see here, I'm boosting around 2K at 10 dB for no reason on a very sharp Q. So this means that I'm only boosting 2K and a few other frequencies that surround it, but not many. Certainly not as many as this band anyway. If you want to go in and really remove frequencies, the best way to do that is with a very narrow Q, because you're only going to be affecting the frequency that you want to, rather than surrounding frequencies. The third control is the frequency, which is this one. Now, frequency determines which frequency the band is affecting, or in most cases where the Q determines that a range of frequencies will be affected, where the centre of the frequency range is. So if I want to boost 200 Hz, we'll just leave it there. So at the minute I'm boosting quite a wide range of frequencies. Now if I want to boost a very tight band of frequencies, I simply adjust the Q control to suit, like that. And obviously it's the same for cutting. That's cutting a wide range of frequencies. That's cutting a very tight range of frequencies. Now generally for cutting, you want it tight. Boost wide, cut tight is usually the principle that a lot of audio engineers follow, although there are no rules, so it's up to you. So in my opinion, subtractive EQ is the best EQ. So as we've just discussed, you can either boost a frequency or cut it. However, just because you can boost doesn't necessarily mean you should. It's better to remove frequencies or to pull frequencies down in most situations. When you increase a frequency, the plugin has to create extra sounds that weren't there before. When you cut or remove frequencies, you're just reducing part of the existing sound, so it stays more natural and realistic. This is why a lot of audio engineers recommend cutting rather than boosting, as it sounds way more natural. I think it's definitely essential to cut on sounds that are organic, natural sounds like piano, Rhodes, strings, drums. Try and always cut on them, because, you know, boosting sounds unnatural and you want to keep it, well, in my case, you want to keep it as natural sounding as possible. So what to do if you want to get a beefier bottom end? Simply pull down the high end. Of course you can boost it if you want to, but it's a good idea to try the subtractive approach first. Rather than boosting the bass, you're cutting the highs, and that makes the bass sound louder and fatter. So as I mentioned earlier, a common approach in equalization and in mixing is to cut narrow and boost wide. Now while we're on the topic, there are a few best practices for cutting and boosting frequencies. When you're cutting cutting a frequency, it's best to make it a narrow Q. So in order to make it a narrow Q, all you need to do is simply make sure that the Q value is high and a bit deeper. Whereas if you're boosting, it's better for it to be a wider Q, which means a lower Q value, but shallower. This is not a hard and fast rule. If you're recording at home or have a less than perfect take in the studio, you may find yourself cutting wide fairly regularly. And if you just need a sound to poke through in a small range, you might introduce a narrow EQ, though still shallow. So the next technique is low and high pass filters. So I find one of the reasons I most frequently use EQ is to slap a low or high pass filter on. Now, a low pass filter boosts or alternates the high frequencies, whereas the high pass filter does the same for the low frequencies. So I'll just show you that in practice now. You can see here I've got a high pass filter, which is allowing the high frequencies to pass and therefore removing the bass. And you can see here I've got a low pass filter, allowing the low frequencies to pass through and removing the highs. So when I'm mixing, I think a lot of other producers do this also, is we slap on a high pass filter on every track other than the kick drum and the bass, unless we have other instruments that we want the bass from, but that's not usually that common. There's low frequencies in a lot of sounds. Even hi-hats have or can have a great deal of low end in them, so it's important to remove the low frequencies off every sound that you don't need it on in order to keep your mixes very clean. So another technique I want to mention is cutting holes. So even when you're not controlling low frequency build-up, you'll still need to cut holes in certain instruments. It's important to let an instrument dominate its primary frequency range, so you need to make sure that you're cutting holes in your instruments that will complement each other. For instance, the human voice is generally strongest in the 3.5K area, so if I found another instrument was competing with this space in the frequency spectrum, I'd pull them down. If you've got a vocal sitting around 3.5K, let's say, and you've got maybe, I don't know, some strings sitting up there as well, whichever sound you want to come through more, which is usually the vocal, you need to pull down the strings in that section. 3.5K on the strings, just simply pull it down a little bit, like this. So if I put this on 3.5, turn it on, turn the key up, which means it's cutting more sharply at 3.5 rather than changing or alternating the frequencies around there, and pull it down by around 4 dB, but this is going to change depending on your mix. And that just gives enough room for the vocal to sit in front of the strings rather than the strings dominating the vocal. Make sure that you're always keeping space in the mix for every instrument. This kind of ties into planning your session and arrangement. You know, finding instruments to fill up each major block along the spectrum, and then make sure that they are the strongest in their ranges with the help of subtractive EQ. This is what is known as the wall of sound. So while on the subject of cutting out holes for sounds, I want to mention that sometimes instruments can be made to sit better in a busy mix if you use the high and low cut filters to almost bracket individual sounds, removing unnecessary high and low frequencies in that sound. So a common problem is to have too much low end in instruments other than the kick drum and bass guitar, for example. As I just mentioned, you want to place a low cut filter on every channel besides your kick and your bass. Your mix is going to sound a lot cleaner for it, and it's going to help your bass sit forward in the mix and sound as clean as possible. Another good reason to control the low end of all your sounds is a psychoacoustic effect known as frequency masking, which basically means that loud sounds block out quieter sounds at the same frequency. So imagine you've got a lot of low end from a synthesizer, and then you've got an 808 bass in there as well. Now, if your synthesizer is a lot louder than your bass, your 808 bass, you're not going to be able to hear the bass as well. So this is why the low frequency or the low cut is so important. It's super important when mixing, because you don't want this frequency masking to occur on any of your sounds, you know, not just the low end but anywhere in your mix. This is especially important for bass and vocals, so make sure you've got nothing blocking your vocals, and the same for your bass. Make sure you always judge your final EQ settings with the whole track playing low, otherwise you can't know how the various sounds will work together. So what I'm saying there is try and listen to your track with all the instruments together without solo in it. So upon deciding on your final EQ decisions, make sure that you're listening to your track out of solo, so you're listening to all the channels together, all the instruments together, so you know how that alternation to the sound actually sounding in the whole mix, because sometimes things can sound great. You know, drums can sound fantastic in solo, but as soon as you put them into the mix, they can sound weak and they can sound nasty. So make sure you listen to your whole mix together rather than listening to individual sounds and applying effects to them. So another useful tip that that I really wish someone had told me or I'd found when I first started was finding problem frequencies. Before you get to the stage in your session where you're cutting holes to prevent instruments from fighting for each other, you're going to be using EQ more to remove problematic frequencies. If you find the snare is too boxy, for example, this trick will help you identify the problem and fix it quickly. So first, what we need to do is create a new band. So on this EQ, you just simply click and drag. You want to give this band a high Q setting. We'll go for 20 and raise the gain as high as it goes. Now, raising the gain as high as it goes is actually what a lot of places tell you to do, but I recommend not doing that, because the whole idea is that when you're raising the gain as high as it goes, you're then supposed to search up and down the audio spectrum to find frequencies that stick out or ring. In my experience though, if you're turning the gain up 30 dB, every frequency is going to stick out and it's going to sound nasty. So don't turn it up all the way. Turn it up 15 dB. And then now you need to perform a sweep along the spectrum until the problem sound becomes really prominent. Now you're going to have most problematic frequencies around 1K, 2K and 5K, as well as some maybe around 250 Hz and 500 Hz. When you find the frequency where the problem is at its worst, reduce the gain and change the Q until you've controlled it. So it's a fairly simple trick, but you'd be surprised that so many people attempt to fix a problem with an EQ before they've located the frequency range where it's occurring. Knowing where the problem frequency is just by hearing it can also save you a hell of a lot of time. So I also recommend taking part in some ear training courses as well. There's loads of YouTube videos on that, and there's a few free courses you can take online. Back to the sweeping. Once you find your frequency, I'll say that mine is at 756 Hz. You simply just turn the gain down like that. Depending on how problematic it is, will depend on how much you reduce it by. In my experience, I wouldn't reduce it all the way by 30 dB because it can sound kind of strange if you've not got any of that frequency in a sound. Maybe reduce it by what you boosted it by, maybe 15. Maybe 10 to 15, and you can adjust the Q as well to get it more sharp if you want, or more kind of in the area of the problem, because not all problems are kind of one frequency. They can be multiple, they can be a kind of clutter or build up of frequencies, so sometimes you want to remove a general area. For me, I like to remove around 500 Hz, so I'll drag this down to around 500. There we go. So I like to keep it around there, so the Q's on 8.3, and that kind of gets the area 500, which I'm what I'm looking for, because I'm not looking to just take out 500. You know, I want a bit before and a bit after, just to make sure that I'm removing, in this case, all the mud. Alright, so another reason to actually cut frequencies rather than boost is because the human hearing system actually notices EQ boosts much more than cuts, especially if the region being treated is very narrow, so a high Q or low bandwidth, for example. Alright guys, that's it for this tutorial. If you're new around here, please subscribe, and if this video has helped you, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.